Have you ever felt that there are memories hidden in the earth, as if the soil holds stories that time tried to erase? Sometimes, when silence and intuition meet, the people realize that certain traces don't just belong to the past, they belong to soul. If you feel that some discoveries are not coincidences, perhaps this video be exactly what you needed to hear. Imagine a world before the flood, not just as legend, but as a cycle of humanity trying to return to the surface. Archaeological
Fragments, structures that do not should exist, marks left by hands that knew more than modern science admits. Every piece, every stone and every riddle seems to whisper, there was something before us, something too big to forget. And as much as official history tries to organize everything into comfortable dates, there are discoveries recent works that break this fine line between myth and memory. They appear as small cracks of light in an ancient portal, submerged cities, impossible tools, calendars older than time itself, and structures that have withstood cataclysms as if they were built to survive them. Today, let us walk together through these buried memories, not through the eyes of doubt, but with the heart of discovery. Because when the truth starts to emerge, it doesn't make noise. It comes like a breath, like a breeze that touches consciousness and asks, what if the world before the flood was not just a story, but a chapter erased from our own journey? If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer may be here, because sometimes what we call a myth is just a dormant memory waiting courage to return. And maybe today you're ready to hear what's always been there. You're waiting now. When we talk about a world before the flood, many imagine only ancient myths, stories told around the fire. But today something different is happening. The science, the geology, archaeology, and even genetics begin to find traces that don't fit in traditional narrative. Traces that seem to light a silent flame saying, there was a world before the great water, and it was much more advanced than we imagined. Revelation does not come in the form of spectacles, but in small sparks gathered over the years, as if the planet were offering pieces of a puzzle that we always avoid putting together. Scientists call the Younger Dryas impact a catastrophic event that would have occurred about 12,800 years ago, an abrupt global cooling, followed by sudden, melting violent floods and the extinction of countless species. However, the most intriguing part is not the event itself, but what it would have destroyed, a previous, highly developed, whose traces begin to emerge, and that changes everything. Suddenly the idea of people who dominated architecture, astronomy, and navigation before the flood do not seem more fantasy. It looks like geological memory. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, structures more than 11,000 years old challenge our understanding. How did supposedly primitive people build such monuments, sophisticated, aligned to specific stars, with millimeter precision? It's as if they were messengers of something that came before, survivors who carried fragments of the lost knowledge. And when we look at submerged cities in Japan, India, and even in the Mediterranean, we realize that they all tell the same silent story. The sea rose and swallowed entire worlds. This interpretation is not an exaggeration. It echoes myths that cross cultures across the planet, and when distant myths agree, perhaps they are describing facts that we have forgotten. It is precisely at this point that the human heart enters, because when we start calling these pieces, we're not just reconstructing science, we are rebuilding identity. What would it say about us discovering that we are not the beginning but the continuation of something very older? Maybe that's why these revelations affect those who hear them so much. In some deep corner of the soul, we felt that we already knew, as if there was a memory hidden, preserved by our ancestors in the form of stories about floods, portals, and fresh starts. They weren't trying to entertain, they were trying to warn. And then the contrast arises. For decades, science rejected the possibility of an organized, advanced, connected pre-flood civilization. But now, the data itself challenged this resistance. Impossibly ancient tools, maps that show regions before the ice melts, structures oriented with astronomical precision that only would be possible with complex calculations. Each discovery opens a new window that challenges the paradigm. What if we are not the first? And if the world we know is not the first version of humanity, but just the latest chapter after a big reset? This emotional synthesis changes the way we look at ourselves. I'm not moss dust, no past. We are descendants of survivors. We carry in genetic memory the marks of drowned worlds, of lost knowledge, of civilizations that perhaps talk to the stars. And the most curious thing is that the more we discover, the more we realize that the question is not if it existed, but how much remains to emerge. Because the true, just like buried cities, it always finds a way to return. If the flood erased an entire world, what exactly did that world leave behind? And why are these clues emerging just now? Among all the discoveries that rekindled the hypothesis of a pre-flood world, few are as impressive as those that emerged from the water. Literally, when entire cities appear underwater, not as legends, but as structures real, measurable, and datable, the narrative changes, and it changes profoundly. The revelation does not come like an explosion. It comes like a whisper that shatters certainties. It was like that when archaeologists found, off Japan, the mysterious Yonaguni, perfect steps, straight walls, geometric platforms that do not resemble natural formations. Dating? More than 10,000 years ago. Before the flood. Before the period that history officially accepted as the beginning of civilization. What's most intriguing is not just the existence of the structure, but what it represents. Yonaguni was actually built by human hands before the waters rose. This means that there were architects, geographers, and sophisticated communities before the last great global catastrophe. Traditional scientific interpretation tries to explain how natural erosion, but just look at the perfect angles, the stairs and the carefully carved levels to realize that there is something there that transcends chance. And that feeling, that something purpose is submerged, it connects to that deep memory we carry as species. The idea that a previous world existed and was swallowed by water. And Yonaguni is not alone. In India, in Combat Bay, sonars revealed streets, straight lines, walls, and patterns of urbanization at a depth where no city should exist, especially not cities dated again, more than 9,000 years ago. And, just like Yonaguni, the scientific narrative hesitates to embrace the obvious. Why admit these cities is admitting that something big was here before us. It is to admit that humanity has already rose, grew, built, and fell before gigantic waters. This reflection moves with something internal, as if speaking with an ancestral longing for a home that never we visited, but which still pulses in the memory of the soul. And when we compare these structures with accounts from ancient cultures, Sumerians, Egyptians, Greeks, Mayans, we realize that they all talk about the same thing: a world destroyed by water, a cycle interrupted, a wisdom lost. Plato called this world of Atlantis, but indigenous cultures speak of it with other names: lands before of the great ocean, cities under the sea, kingdoms swallowed up by the gods. The convergence between myth and geology no longer seem like a coincidence. It looks like a memory. And when memories appear from so many different sides, perhaps they are not fantasy. Perhaps they are echoes of something that really happened. But this is where the contrast emerges that provokes us to look deeper. Modern science advances, discovers, measures, maps, but hesitates. Not for lack of evidence, but for lack of comfortable explanations. How to accept that highly advanced people existed before of the agricultural period? How to admit that monumental structures precede history itself? Writing. This hesitation reveals more about us than about the past. Reveal our fear of new beginnings. Because if one advanced world was destroyed, what's to stop another from being destroyed? This question echoes deeply, making the heart pause for a moment. The synthesis of all this is not fear, but silent recognition. Humanity does not start it from scratch. We emerge from ruins, carrying fragments of knowledge bigger than we imagine. Maybe that's why impossible structures fascinate us so much. Pyramids, megaliths, prehistoric calendars, astronomical alignments, millimeters. They're not just constructions, they're messages. They are a reminder that we are living in the first version of the world, but the continuation of a work that it started much earlier than the books tell us. And this awareness changes us, not as science, but as spirit. And when we look at the bottom of the ocean, at the submerged cities that little by little reappear through sonar, photographs, and rare dives, the question is inevitable. What else is hidden? How many ancient capitals sleep under miles of water, preserving stories, symbols, and technologies from a time we have forgotten? These traces do not appear by chance. They emerge as if the planet itself were bringing back chapters that can no longer remain buried. And so we come to the hook of this block, which opens the door to revelations even more deep. If entire cities reappear beneath the sea, what about the structures that never existed, have sunk, and continue to challenge everything we think we know about our past? If the submerged cities show us a flooded past, they are the structures still in standing, firm, inexplicable, and challenging, that reveal the depth of the mystery. A revelation begins with a monument that everyone knows but few understand: the pyramids. When we look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, we are not looking at a common construction, but a mathematical puzzle made of stone. She is not just ancient, it is impossible for the time in which it is said to have been built. Accuracy, astronomical engineering, millimeter engineering, symmetry that defies primitive tools. Everything in it seems to suggest an inheritance, not a beginning, as if the Egyptians hadn't nothing invented there, but inherited the remains of knowledge prior to the flood. And it's not just the pyramid. In different parts of the planet, structures appear so complex and so old that science itself hesitates when framing them. The megaliths of Baalbek, for example. Gigantic stones, some weighing more than 1,000 tons, positioned perfectly on a base that predates known civilizations. Who could move, adjust, and lift such heavy blocks at a time when not even the wheel was it widespread? The most impressive thing is that all these structures align with specific constellations, as if whoever erected them was recording the sky from an earlier age, perhaps a pre-flood heaven. This pattern appears repeatedly as a signature of lost astronomical knowledge. This is where the interpretation gains emotional strength. Imagine for a moment that before the Great Cataclysm, there was a global civilization not in the political sense, but in the sense of shared knowledge. It is not necessary to imagine futuristic ships or technologies. Just imagine a people who understood the sky, who mastered stones, acoustics, mathematics, and natural cycles with a precision that today we are just beginning to recover. A modern science is impressed by lasers, but thousands of years ago there were cameras with perfect acoustics, corridors aligned to the solstice, and buildings with harmony geometry so precise that it surpasses the capabilities of many current engineers. And then comes the reflection that touches the heart of those who observe without prejudice. Why so many cultures, separated by oceans, built pyramids? Why did so many rise megaliths aligned to the sky? Why do they all talk about a flood, a lost world, an earlier time where gods walked among them? Were they not? Speaking of supernatural beings, but of survivors, heirs of knowledge pre-Diluvian people who tried to rebuild the ruined world? Maybe what we call of gods are distorted memories of men and women who carried a wisdom that we are still trying to decipher. But it's the contrast that makes everything more impactful. Traditional science tries to fit these structures within a strict timeline that begins around 6,000 years ago. However, when we honestly analyze the data, this timeline does not hold up. The marks of water erosion on the Sphinx, for example, point to a period in which the Egypt was green and rainy, something that only happened more than 9,000 years ago. This means that someone was there before the desert, before the dynasties, before the world, as we know. And this brings us face to face with an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the known history is just the last chapter of a book rewritten countless times. The synthesis of this block is not just scientific, is deeply human. If there was a previous civilization, it has not completely disappeared. She left messages on the stone, codes in mathematics, maps in the sky. She left echoes that resonate in temples, statues, alignments, and myths. And we, as distant descendants, feel this heritage pulsating inside us when we contemplate these monuments, because deep down, the soul recognizes what the mind has forgotten. If these structures withstood the flood, what about technology and knowledge that may have been erased, and that may be beginning to return now piece by piece, revelation by revelation? When we try to understand what really existed before the flood, one of the most forts is not just in the stones or monuments, but in the stories themselves left by the oldest people on Earth. The revelation of this block arises from the fact that civilizations separated by oceans, continents, and millennia tell the same narrative. The humanity was almost destroyed by a great water, and before it there was knowledge extraordinary. This pattern is no coincidence. It's memory, shared memory, fragmented and preserved like someone trying to save pages of a book before the fire destroys them. Consume completely. The most impressive thing is that now science starts to find evidence that supports exactly these ancient stories. In Mesopotamia, Sumerian tablets describe a time before the flood, called Ancient Age of Kings, a time when advanced beings transmitted knowledge astronomical, agricultural, and mathematical. In the Americas, the Mayans speak of cycles of destruction and rebirth, described with dates so precise that even today they surprise researchers. The Egyptians speak of a period called Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods taught humanity before a cataclysm that changed everything. And in indigenous traditions, from Australia to Alaska, they all point to an earlier world which collapsed under the water. This kind of convergence is too rare to ignore. When we interpret these narratives with the sensitivity of the heart and the curiosity of the reason, we realize that they are not just symbolic stories. They carry details too specific, too astronomical alignments, too consistent chronologies to be mere inventions. The reflection that blossoms from there is profound. Are we reading myths as fantasy tales when they are actually translated historical accounts in spiritual language? Maybe our ancestors weren't trying to poeticize the world, but to record, in the only way possible, the trauma of a destroyed cycle. And this trauma resonates with us because perhaps we are direct descendants of these survivors. But it is precisely in the contrast between the ancient and the modern that we perceive the true dimension of this mystery. Traditional science prefers to label everything as an allegory or superstition, but recent advances have begun to erode this security. Examples. This is due to new geological dating methods which show carbon peaks coinciding with global catastrophic events. The abrupt melting of glaciers that only it could be explained by impacts or gigantic explosions. And the most surprising, signs that highly organized human populations already existed before the period officially accepted as the beginning of civilization. These data are no longer exceptions. They are standards. The emotional synthesis of this painting is powerful. When we realize that we are not the first chapter, something changes inside us. A kind of cosmic humility appears, a recognition that we have inherited a history that we do not fully understand. And, at the same time, a consolation is born. If our ancestors survived cataclysms unimaginable and rebuilt the world, perhaps we too carry this strength. Maybe there is an ancient wisdom dormant in each of us, waiting to be remembered, just as sunken cities wait patiently beneath the ocean. And then appears that calm restlessness that drives us forward. If all these people were trying to tell us something, why aren't we listening? What exactly did they see, feel, and live before the waters rose? Why so many cultures emphasized the need to preserve knowledge in stone, stars, and myths? The question is not just historical, it is spiritual. Maybe they knew this wouldn't be the last cycle, and that one day we would look back with the same thirst for answers as they had when looking at the sky. If all these cultures point to knowledge prior to the flood, where is this knowledge now? And who are the silent guardians who tried to preserve it for us? When we seek to understand what survived from the world before the flood, we inevitably come to the silent guardians of this knowledge, not specific people but places, structures, codes, and traditions that seem to have been designed across ages. The revelation begins when we realize that certain monuments were not created just to worship gods or mark territories. They were built like vaults memory. Göbekli Tepe, for example, is not just a temple. It's a time capsule intentionally buried, as if whoever built it knew that a new future I would need to find her. Its columns with animals, symbols, and constellations seem to scream, remember what came before. And this sense of purpose transcends logic, common archaeological. When we observe these structures, we realize that many of them carry patterns mathematicians who would only be rediscovered thousands of years later. Perfect polygons, geometric relationships, solar and lunar alignments, proportions that echo the number golden. All of this set in stone long before any known civilization master such calculations. This leads us to the inevitable interpretation. There was knowledge coherent, transmitted, preserved, and replicated in distant places. One knowledge that seems to have survived only in fragments, as if each people had held onto a part of ancestral memory before the world was remade. The reflection that arises is intense. What if these guardians were not individuals, but traditions whole? The indigenous people of Australia speak of song lines, sacred trails that they preserve the geography, cosmology, and history of pre-human eras. The Mayans hid wisdom in calendars that defy modern understanding to this day. In Egypt, priests kept records of solar cycles and cataclysms going back thousands of years before the first dynasties. And, in Teos, each of these cultures, the same message appears disguised. This didn't start with us, we're just taking care of what's left. Suddenly myth turns into instruction, and history becomes an echo of something bigger. But it's the contrast that makes this mystery even deeper. Modern science, trying to fit everything into a linear chronology, ends up ignoring clear signs that certain traditions preserved, orally, knowledge that should never have existed in their epochs. How can we explain that? Polynesian people traced oceanic routes using stars with modern browser accuracy? How can we explain that isolated tribes did the Amazon know astronomical cycles that they had never observed directly? How explain that Arctic myths accurately describe the sky and climate over 10,000 years ago? It's as if, even as the world fell apart, memory found a way to survive. And it is precisely from this convergence that the emotional synthesis of this block is born. We realize that we are not just biological descendants. We are descendant spiritual spirits of a world that has disappeared. We carry in our collective consciousness the echo of teachings that we no longer know how to translate, but that touch us deeply when found again. Maybe that's why certain symbols fascinate us, certain structures hypnotize us, certain stories give us goosebumps. The soul recognizes what the body never lived. And somehow these clues emerging now remind us that nothing is truly lost. Everything waits to be remembered. And then the question arises that takes us forward. Why now? Why in recent years so many discoveries begin to emerge at the same time? It would just be progress technological? Or are we entering a new cycle in which what was hidden need to return? This doubt is not just scientific, it is existential. Because when pieces so old begin to appear together, it seems as if time itself is in our calling to recover something we have forgotten. Maybe we are closer to past than we imagine. If all these memories survived the floodwaters, what exactly did they do? Do you want to teach us now that you have returned to the surface of time? Perhaps the most important thing of all this is not proving the existence of a world before flood, but realize what this world is still trying to tell us. Because when we unite submerged cities, impossible monuments, converging myths, and preserved memories in stone, something bigger begins to emerge. Not just a forgotten past, but a silent reminder that humanity has faced ends before, and he survived, and started again, and left clues so that one day, when we were ready, we could remember who we really are. There is a profound beauty in this revelation, as if the earth itself would embrace us and say, "You are not alone on the journey." When we look to this lost past, we not only find knowledge, we find humility. We realize that we are heirs to something immensely greater than our recent stories. We discover that we are not a cosmic accident, but a continuity, that there are memories in our DNA, in our intuition, in our dreams, and that perhaps the awakening that so many people feel today is nothing new. It is souvenir, an old memory, coming from a time when humanity walked among stars, waters, and mysteries with more wisdom than we imagine. If this message touched something inside you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul may be remembering the path. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of something that the soul never forgot?